So in this video, we're going to talk about long-term rentals. And I call these the bread and butter of real estate investing. Now, typically when people think about investing in real estate, they either think about investing and buying in a long-term rental, which is where you buy a home and put a tenant in there for, a year or more, or they think about flipping a home. Now, as I discussed earlier, I consider flipping a home a business, not real estate investing. Now, buying a rental property or as a long-term rental, that is definitely investment because you're buying it and you're putting a tenant in there for a long-term hold. Now, before we dive into the details on here, I want to switch over to Property Llama because we'll be using Property Llama a lot for this and the next 4 ways we're analyzing the strategies. So I'm taking the same property, and this is a property I own in my portfolio, and we're going to analyze it as a long-term rental, as a medium-term rental, as a short-term rental, as a house hack, and as a room-by-room rental. This way it's the same property, and we can talk about the different variables on there when it comes to managing that property. So this property is a house with an ADU. The main house is a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, and that's the house at the front of the lot. Now at the back of the lot is called a carriage house, or ADU, or sometimes people call it a granny flat, but it's a separate structure. It's its own tiny home, which is a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. And it's not like the tiny homes you see on HGTV, today. This is a legitimate tiny home that was built, 20 or actually probably like 30 or 40 years ago on the property. All right, so let's talk about long-term rentals here, since they are the bread and butter of real estate investing. So jumping to the spectrum here, deal availability. I call it pretty high or medium to high in terms of being able to find a deal. Now, at my brokerage, we do close to 200 transactions a year. The vast majority of rental properties we buy are long-term rentals, and we find them off the MLS. Now, it definitely takes some time. We search for properties. We look at multiple properties. It definitely does take some time. But you don't have to go look out at 1,000 properties. You can usually look at a dozen or a couple dozen, depending where you're at, and find a relatively pretty good deal that if you buy today in the current market over the next 5 years, it makes a huge impact on your long-term wealth building. So this is something that your lender and your real estate agent can help you find and should not be a major issue. Time. Now, time in finding the property, again, is minimal because most of them come off the MLS. Occasionally, they'll come off market or from network, but then your real estate agent can do a lot of the sorting for you. And then once you buy the property, you have no problem hiring a property manager, or if you want to manage it yourself, you can do it either way. And both of those are relatively low on time. And there's lots of resources for self-managing or hiring a property manager. Skill. I would put the skill on this as pretty low as well. There definitely is some learning curve to analyzing the properties, and if you are going to self-manage on operating the properties. But again, it's all relatively something that you can learn, and your real estate team can help you out with a lot of those resources and skill. Risk, I call it relatively low because if you go out there and buy a rental, a long-term rental, there's usually a huge tenant pool and a huge demand pool for buying that property. So relatively low risk because you'd have a high demand for people that want to rent the property. Of course, you got to make sure the numbers make sense. Network, do you need a huge network for buying and operating a long-term rental? No, you don't. Again, I would lean heavily on your agent and lender because they can help you with property management referrals, some contractor referrals, things like that. But you don't need like a high network or a big network of real estate professionals to go out there and buy and operate a long-term rental. Capital. For a long-term rental, typically you are going to need some capital here. So, all these other items are low, in terms of like the risk and that, but the capital is usually going to be on the higher side because a lot of times rental properties will take, a 15 to 30% down payment. Now, the vast majority of people put down a 25% down payment. It's kind of the typical go-to norm for what you put down when you buy a rental property. So if you're buying, a $400,000 property, you're gonna need $100,000 plus some other capital to go out there for the down payment and closing cost. Financing availability, Lots of financing you can get for these properties. Again, your lender will have a lot of different financing options, 30-year fixed programs that you can use to buy these properties. So let's jump over to Property Llama here. And we're going to ignore the stuff up here for the portfolio. Since I have the same property 5 times in here, this is kind of like wonky. We were really just going to look at each property individually. Now I'm opening up the long-term rental, and I have a shorthand called LTR for it, so we can see what it looks like. So this property, because I'm getting ready to sell it, market should be about a $590,000 purchase price, and we are assuming a 25% down payment plus some closing cost and some repair cost as well. So definitely, you got to have some capital to go out there and invest in the property. And then we have very basic underwriting on here. Since this is got 2 houses on here, I just talked to my property manager, or you can go out there and use a service like a Rentometer to help you go out there and estimate rents. So I got the 2 long-term rents for this house, which I think was $2,500 up front and $1,600 out back. So there's my rent income. I put in a vacancy of 5%, which is pretty normal for my market. Monthly property taxes, monthly insurance, a 10% property management fee. A lot of times those are between like 8 to 10% for a long-term rental. And then maintenance. Hey, am I going to spend $328 a month on maintenance? No, but little things break. You have to go in there and repair things. You have tenant cost turns. You'll have some big replacements once in a while, like a water heater or air conditioner. And so I like to budget between 5 to 10% for my properties, at least here in the Denver market, for maintenance, and also just putting some money aside for future repairs. And then utilities on here, a lot of times the tenant will pay for the utilities, but again, it kind of depends on where your market, the property, things like that. But you can see here, this is basic underwriting. And I'm not going to go into all the details on here because it's fairly straightforward and something your agent and your lender can walk you through to give you like accurate numbers for your local market. But we have the rent. We take all these expenses, which are the operating expenses, and we have a net operating income of $2,600 and change. We'll have a 30-year loan payment at a 5.5% interest rate, and I have to pay that every month. And then I cash flow about $120 a month. So we'll call it $100 even. All right, so let's jump back up here and actually look at these 4 returns up here, because this is something we're going to compare a lot as we go through the next strategies on here. So the majority of my return is going to come from appreciation. And for all of these, I have the same assumptions across these properties. A 3% appreciation growth, a 3% rent growth, which is about in historical inflation. And depending on your market, it might be a little higher, might be a little bit lower. In Denver, it's a little bit lower than normal, but I always like to be conservative on my estimates so I can figure out how much I'm going to make on there. But you can see here, altogether, I should make about $29,000 in year 1 on this investment. So that gives me a total of about just under a 20% return in the first year. Now, cash flow is about 1% of that because cash flow is $100 a month. Now, if you want more cash flow, you can come in here and put a higher down payment down. But if you put a higher down payment down, other aspects of the return will change as well. And this is something I actually really encourage people to come in here and play with as you're underwriting and figuring things out. Well, hey, I don't like this cash flow. Well, great. You have a couple options on here. You can go out there and find a better property, maybe like a higher cap rate property, or you can put more money down. And all those are variables that will start adjusting, their returns. And it's all about finding, hey, what's the right return for you? Now, for a lot of my clients, and myself included, I'm happy with, I don't need a huge cash flow because I have my income from my businesses. My wife has a job. All of our clients who buy long-term rentals, they're not worried about cash flow today. Hey, they want the properties to pay for themselves, but they're not worried about living off the property today. It's a long-term investment because over the next 5, 10 years, they want to increase their cash flow. They want to increase their equity position on here. So you can see here, I will get about $32,000 a year in net operating income, but about $1,500 a year in cash flow. So I'm going to come in here and play with one variable real quick. Go back to the down payment. And let's just say I want to do a higher down payment. So let's just say my current loan balance is going from about $442,000 to about $400,000. I'm not quite sure what percent that is, but it should knock off, it'll knock down some. And then we can come back here and see what that does to the return profile. Well, now you can see here my cash flow jumped up by about, $3,000 a year. We went from like $1,400 to about $4,300. So I got more cash flow. But here's the interesting thing. My overall return is now lower at a 16.5% versus a 20% return. Now, is that good or bad? No, it just depends on what you want to do. If you want more cash flow, then put more money down or find a higher performing, better performing property. Again, personally, I'm still in the growth phase. So rather than putting an extra $40,000 or $50,000 down on this property, I'd rather put down as little as possible and make sure the cash flow is, about break even or cash flowing some. But I want the higher return because that means I'm getting a higher return on my dollars invested in there. So I'm going to come back in here and just change that to the down payment so I don't, as we compare it to other properties, we can keep it apples to apples. But that's just one thing that it's very important for you as an investor to talk about with your agent and really talk about with your lender as well, because a lot of times there's a lot of other variables that your lender can play with, and he or she will sit down with you and go through his details about buying the interest rate down, prepaying some costs, items like that. But that's really discussion for your lender and your agent so they can tailor it to the current market conditions, your local market, and of course what's going on in the world, and of course what you have available to you as a borrower in terms of capital, credit score, things like that. But this is the high-level overview about how a long-term rental works. If you have any questions, let me know. But this is where you want to rely heavily on your agent and lender to look at, hey, what are some good long-term rentals in the current marketplace?